We welcome you to this presentation, which is called the Conservatism Corollary, and of course is based on the work of Dr. Wolfensberger. So let's start with what are we talking about when we talk about this idea of the conservatism corollary. First of all, I think that when we hear the word conservatism, we immediately think about politics, and I just want to emphasize this is not about politics. What we're really using that word to mean is to make available, to offer choices to people that are the more valued options within the society. It's not about forcing people to do anything, but having an awareness, a consciousness that whenever we can, however we can, we want to offer to people the more valued options. And then the corollary, what does that mean? Well, corollary is a proposition that follows from another that's already been proven. Inferring or deducting something based on information that you've gathered. One way to quickly say this is, if this, then that. That would be, the brief way of thinking about the term corollary. So when we put these two together, we're thinking about the idea of if people are experiencing societal devaluation as a result of bias, then we would want to make efforts to do whatever we can to offer the most valued, societally valued options to tip the scales in the positive. Here are some phrases that you might have heard that really encapsulate this idea of the conservatism corollary. And you might have even used them about your life, or you might have heard somebody use them about your life. So giving somebody a leg up, giving an advantage, right? Stacking the deck for success, okay? And of course, when you are thinking about going to college or university, I am sure, you put thought into thinking about what can you do to be successful in your field of study. As well, another saying that you might be familiar with is increasing the chance to beat the odds. And so you'll hear that sometimes in sports. What can a team do to increase the chance to beat the odds? And then the image that I referred to previously, the idea of tipping the scales to the positive, or creating the possibility that the scales can be tipped to the positive. The conservatism corollary is based on a fundamental assumption that we start with the idea that all people have hurtful and even wounding life experiences that cause vulnerability. So, for example, failure or rejection, maybe a divorce, maybe a long sustained time of not working and having a regular income. So these are some of the kinds of experiences that anybody can have that make you vulnerable. But we are also making the assumption that people who have been cast into a societally devalued status exist in a state of heightened vulnerability. Now, what do we mean by heightened vulnerability? We mean that bad things are likely to happen and have a more devastating impact in your life if you are part of a group in society that is devalued. Another way to think about this idea of heightened vulnerability is that if there are hard times in a society, who gets hit the hardest? And I think we recently have seen examples of this in our society. If there's oppression, who is more likely to be oppressed first and more deeply? It's people who have been cast into a devalued status. If there is injustice, it is people who are societally devalued or who are more likely to bear it. If there's prejudice, people who are devalued are more likely to experience it more deeply. And so again, we can look at our society. Many voices in our society have been raised recently saying we are more vulnerable because of being societally devalued due to bias. And so that would include, you think about the Black Lives Matter movement. It's been a very strong voice about the vulnerability that people live with. People from the Asian community, certainly people who live with disabilities have also given voice to this heightened vulnerability. I just want to remind you of what we talked about in an earlier part of this series, and that is the consequences of bias and devaluation. And so, for example, being cast into negative roles. For example, being put into the role of being dangerous or a menace or pitiful and an object of pity, or a burden to other people, or an incapable, dependent person who will be a lifelong client. And being distanced from people and opportunities from people who have a valued status, and also opportunities that are available for people with valued status. So you can see the end of this litany as clearly discrimination, and obviously, if in fact you are experiencing even some of these consequences, it's going to make you very vulnerable. The experiences I just referred to can literally be thought of as bricks, that are added on top of one another. And these bricks, low expectations, not good opportunities to learn, being stigmatized, surrounded by negative images that convey negative messages about you, being cast into negative roles, such as that of being dangerous or a menace, or a child who will never grow up, an incapable, dependent person who will be a lifelong client, and so forth. And literally, these experiences, one on top of another, or very heavy experiences, can crush a person. And this is another example of thinking about an image you can hold in your mind for heightened vulnerability: bricks being thrust on top of people and weighing them down. So this is another image that you can use to think about heightened vulnerability, or to understand heightened vulnerability. The societal forces that are present in all societies that can spin you out into heightened vulnerability are centrifugal forces. So what does that mean? That means forces that keep pushing you out, no matter where you are in one of these circles. There are those forces to push you further outside to the very margins of society and even existence. So you could be right there in the middle. Let's say you're a person who has education, you have a very good job as an architect, and you take your lunch break and go out to lunch, and you're careful crossing the street, but there's a reckless driver who hits you. You're injured very badly, and you have now a lifelong disability as a result of experiencing traumatic brain injury. And like that, you become, moved, spun out, right, into devaluation. You could be at risk of being devalued. So for example, if you're an older person, but you're healthy and you have a pretty good income, and then you become ill with an illness that's pretty debilitating, you get spun into margins and maybe into devaluation. You could be on the margins of social devaluation. And let's say somebody, Black and brown students who live in impoverished areas and don't get opportunities for good education. So you can see the forces that are at work early on that that can push people to the margins and sometimes over the edge of existence. And then you may actually be in, the circles where you are, devalued, but only kind of mildly devalued. I'm thinking about a gentleman I know who's very smart, but he does lack some judgment in social interactions and engagement. And just that lack of judgment in some social situations and engagement has caused him to be spun into further devaluation because his actions have been misinterpreted. And one time the police were called. Really, there was no need for that, but it was just a misinterpretation on the part of the people that he was engaging with. And he ended up, getting written up for that, and it was more than a ticket. And so, he's spun, now he has a reputation, okay? And so he's spun into further devaluation. Just want to tell you the story of Rhonda, who was a student at university. She was so excited to be going to university when she finished school at age 18. And Rhonda has a physical disability, and she thought a lot about the kind of support that she needed. And one of the things she knew that she would need to get around to classes is a scooter. And so she approached the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation to see if they would assist her to get a scooter, and they agreed. Well, they did order it. It arrived after Rhonda had gotten to university, and her scooter did not fit into the elevator very well. It was really difficult to get in, and so she started missing lots of classes, which then put her behind, which made her really anxious. On top of that, she was often missing meals, and then on top of that, so her health started, kind of not being as good as it had been. Her energy became low. Then on top of that, the university did assign her a work-study job to help pay for her tuition, but the hours of this job were 7 p.m. to 11 p.m., which for Rhonda was very difficult because she was already struggling to get through the day. And when she gets up in the morning, it takes her double the amount of time to get ready than it would if she didn't have, the physical disabilities. So she was getting up at 5 in the morning. And after a month of this, Rhonda literally fell apart. And she had a breakdown and had to leave university and never really fully recovered from that, and certainly didn't go back to university. So what happened to Rhonda? She was spun right off the edge there. Her adult life was profoundly interrupted. And, it really, she's been struggling ever since to get back on track. That's heightened vulnerability. What for students with a relatively valued non-vulnerable status might be an inconvenience, for a student who has devalued status and are vulnerable may be a major barrier. So I'm thinking about one student I know who, he's unable to use words to communicate, and communicates pretty effectively through an iPad. But that is enough of a difference to create a barrier for him communicating with people. So people will come, they'll look at him, they'll say hi, and they'll ask him a question, and then he, reaches for his iPad and starts to respond, and people, think he's not paying attention to them, or they don't really understand that he's using the iPad to communicate, and they walk away. So this has been a major barrier for him in terms of, developing relationships of different kinds on campus. What might be seen as a right for students who have a valued societal status and are relatively non-vulnerable may be seen as a privilege or even denied to people who are devalued. So just access to an inclusive education has been denied to many students with disabilities because of their disability, which despite we have, laws against that, and we have all kinds of safeguards supposedly in our system, that still happens. What might, for us, for example, for a student with a valued status that's relatively non-vulnerable, what would be like every day and just taken for granted? Maybe for a student who's devalued and very vulnerable, be difficult, maybe impossible to achieve. So an example of that would be developing friendships of all different kinds. And you can think back to the young man who I mentioned initially, who really, because of communication, and the barrier with that, it's just been impossible for him. He's done quite well in school, except for this one area, and he's alone and lonely. The conservatism corollary is a very conscious strategy then to try to deal with that idea of heightened vulnerability, to bend over backwards from, first of all, not adding to that load of bricks. We showed you that image earlier of the bricks. We don't want to add any additional bricks. We don't want any additional bricks to be added. So doing everything possible to assist the students so those additional bricks don't get added. Secondly, reduce the load of bricks. And then thirdly, positive compensation for disadvantage. I think if you go back to the story of the student that I told you about who used the scooter, boy, there's some things that could have been done there to reduce that load of bricks. So somebody who, understood, was paying attention and could assist her to, get a different scooter, right? And in the meantime, have access to other ways of getting around, so that the student could get to class, could attend, right? And then when the scooter came, making sure that she had an opportunity to practice using it, which she hadn't had. And then this is very straightforward, to find a job, that would be a simpler or better hours, not simpler job, but better hours for her and fit in with her schedule, so that she wouldn't have been so stressed. And certainly the scooter would have taken care of a number of things. But then you wonder, where was the support to assist her before she got to the point of having a total breakdown? So, a variety of different kinds of supports could have been used. The conservatism corollary then, as we said, is a very conscious, intentional idea to think about offering valued options to students. And so to think about this and to really identify, the valued options and even the most valued options possible, we can use this idea or the image that's here on the screen. So if we think about specifically university and college, okay, and being a young adult and wanting to move forward in your young adult life, what would be options, okay, that people would not want, okay? So for example, I don't think most young adults really want to be excluded. I don't think that young adults want to be in a position where their parents or other people are making all of the decisions for them. I don't think that young adults want to be in a position where they're always being monitored and always watched. That would be seen, those options would be seen as less common, and even more than that, more negatively valued. In the middle there would be the kinds of opportunities and options that most students who are going to university are expecting to have available to them, at least some of those options. So a big expectation, I think, for university, college students is to experience freedom and to be able to make more of your own decisions. Social life is also in an expectation, I think, that people have, that we're going to have an opportunity to meet new people, maybe people from all different places, and I will have an opportunity to explore interests. So that is where we would want to start. At least social role valorization talks about the culturally valued analog, if you remember that. And so the culturally valued analog is represented there by that middle of the bell curve. In other words, that's what most people, most students and so forth expect, want, and so forth. Now, that we would certainly want to make that available for people. We also want to, whenever we can, offer students the most valued options possible. So, for example, study abroad is something that can be really exciting and sought after. Making all kinds of connections through internships and maybe even through courses for future employment opportunities. Partners in life. Many people meet a lifelong partner at university. And we can't make that happen, obviously, but having opportunities to meet lots of people, do lots of things with different people and so forth, you may find your soulmate. So the conservatism corollary, as you look at the bottom of that diagram, you see that we are thinking about offering at least what is typical, common, and valued. But whenever we can, because of the heightened vulnerability, we want to offer the most valued options possible. All of it, we want authentic student experience. Now, I'm just going to share a story from my daughter's life who has taught me an awful lot. And when there was a meeting with her to plan for what she wanted to do for her future while she was still in high school. And Mary said that she wanted to go to university. And the people at the table looked at her, really didn't respond much, and said, well, we have a plan for you. After you go to your graduation ceremony, you can still stay in school for 2 years. And what we have in mind for you is that you will return to school in September, to the high school, and you will further study math and reading. Now, I really do not know many students who are finishing their senior year of high school, even if they could stay on in school, who choose to do that. Most students are thinking about what they can do after school. And don't have it in their mind that they're going to go back to the same high school the following year. And Mary said no. And when she was asked what she wanted to do, she said, I want to go to university. Well, this was a really new idea for the people who attended that meeting. Mary was thinking for herself. She picked an option, that would be in the middle there. I'm happy to say that Mary did go to university for 4 years, had a very awesome experience. Now let me show you some examples of students where this has been the case. Well, first of all, this picture, you can see those are young people, okay, and they are in a traditional program for students who have been in special ed, and they are in this program within their high school. So they went through high school and special education class, and they stayed beyond the age 18, 17, 18 for 2 more years, and this is how they spent their time. In one room doing those kinds of activities. Now, can you see they're making paper chains there? Where does that fall on the bell curve? Of course, that would fall to the options that people would not want. Now here is an example. a more positive example, and you can be thinking of that diagram that I showed to you. This is a student who went to Millersville University, and he it was part of the inclusive post-secondary initiative there. And in fact, he flourished, he did really well, and indeed, he was chosen by faculty and other students to deliver the commencement address. He was so sought after. Now, where does that fall on that diagram that I showed to you? It's not just in the middle, right? It's over, to the kind of option that people would say, wow, I'd love to be able to do that, to give the commencement address. Another example from around a student who attended Westchester University, and I believe she's still attending there, and she really wanted to become a member of a sorority. This is something is not very typical for students who are living with disabilities, and so she actually did everything you're supposed to do when you want to join a sorority. She did all kinds of research, figured out what one she wanted to do. There were all kinds of requirements. She completed the requirements with assistance from sorority sisters, and they were the regular requirements. And she, I guess you call that rushing the sorority, and she made it. And so now she is a member of the sorority at Westchester University. And we think that she might be one of the first students in inclusive post-secondary education, at least in Pennsylvania, who is a sorority sister. The last one is, this is a student also who you can see attends Temple University. And this student is very focused on working in preschool or in a child care center. And so she has an internship where it's like a perfect fit internship for her. She's had lots of opportunities, working in a preschool that is there or sponsored by Temple, and making connections. Remember I talked about that. That's what a lot of students want, making connections as well as gaining experience, lived experience on what do you, when you're working as a teacher in a preschool, early childhood center, like what do you do? And so this student is having an opportunity to do all of those things. So again, related to that diagram that I talked about, where does that fall? Well, certainly it falls within the experiences that are typically sought after, and even experiences that students really, really want, that will help to set them on the pathway for their career. And now I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Thomas Newville, who is the founder of Integrated Studies at Millersville University and also a professor there. And he knows these ideas quite well and has used them practically many times. And I've asked him to share an example with you.
So thank you, Darcy. The conservatism corollary, it's a very difficult thing to nail. I was trying to think of a story when we use the conservatism corollary. And the truth is, we use it all the time with everybody. So when I think of one student, Daniel, we used it from the time he came on campus. I actually might even say Daniel brought us the conservatism corollary. He spent his PK-12 years in a self-contained classroom. And when he came here, we began with his person-centered planning, getting faculty members, administrators, community members, family in that path so that we could have the best thinking. We began to sort of bend over backwards to position him as not just a student at Millersville, but an excellent student at Millersville. And even when we admitted him, we wouldn't admit him until he was admitted as a full-time student, which is very different than just a certificate student and so forth. And so when he got to be on campus, we had him join multiple clubs, including the theater club. He began to not just take theater classes, but audition for plays, many plays. And we made a point, for example, to introduce him to the president of the university. Not just once, but multiple times. We're trying to put him in a role of knowing people in the university, of knowing what the university is about, of being an actor, and so forth. And his degree program was theater communication and entrepreneurship, because we were marrying his love of culinary arts with his community theater and his desire to start his own restaurant. Even in his student employment positions, we worked with him so that he didn't just work in dining services or the dish room. Daniel worked in catering services, and we worked with catering services so that he was a server at presidential events. There's probably one sort of culminating example of the conservatism corollary with Daniel. And it was when we put his name forward to be the student speaker at commencement, an honored, cherished, valued position that is appointed by the president of the university. And so we put Daniel's name forward, and he was chosen. He was chosen to speak at commencement in front of 4,000 people. That alone is a highly valued role, and we did not want to leave that up just to chance. So what did we do? We spoke to Daniel about what he wanted to say, about who might support him, and we surrounded him with a group of English professors and communication professors to help him write the speech. And when he turned it in to the people at the university who approved such speeches, and there was editing that was needed, those same groups of professors sat with him so that he had the best speech he could possibly create. We didn't stop there. Then we surrounded him with people he knew in the communications and theater department so he could choreograph his speech. And if you went on YouTube and watched Daniel Castellanos' YouTube commencement at Millersville University, you will see a well-delivered, well-acted, well-performed speech in front of 4,000 people. That positioned Daniel not just to be highly thought of and valued at the university, but when he graduated, those years of highly valued roles resulted in a position as sous chef and purchasing agent at a 5-star restaurant downtown Lancaster, because he had the skill, he had the presence, he was connected to the president of the university who knew the owner of the restaurant, and that is what happens when you use the conservatism corollary for people's well-being.
So in conclusion here, I just wanted to summarize, the 3 main points to keep in mind. So always be aware of the idea of heightened vulnerability. Think about it, be conscious of it, and whether you're thinking about your own life, you're helping someone else to think about their life, you're providing support to someone, it's important to remember this. It is oftentimes subtle, okay, and unconscious, and it takes some thought to figure out ways that people are, living in a state of heightened vulnerability. And then the idea of, the conservatism corollary. Because of heightened vulnerability, then we want to make sure that we're thinking in terms of assisting students in whatever way to prevent, reduce, and compensate that load of bricks. And one very concrete, practical, understandable way of doing that is thinking about whenever there is a choice to be made, when a student is faced with a choice, think about that diagram I shared with you. What are the choices that would be sought after by many students who, are involved in post-secondary education? And then even further than that, that's surely what we want to offer, those choices. And then even beyond that, thinking about the choices that, are highly sought after when you are in post-secondary education, and making those available to students who live in a state of heightened vulnerability. Thank you very much for your attention. and I hope you've gotten some information that will be helpful and useful as you are involved in inclusive post-secondary education.